The old veteran leaned back in his chair and stared at the black-and-white photograph in his hands. In it, young British soldiers stood ankle-deep in mud, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but still standing. Behind them, a shattered farmhouse smoked under a gray sky. No medals, no reporters, no dramatic headline. Just men who had held the line. He tapped the corner of the photo and said quietly, almost like he was speaking to himself, "They always tell the story like America arrived and saved the whole war in one sweep, but that's not how it happened. Not even close." The room went still, because the truth, at least the truth he remembered, was far more uncomfortable. By the time American forces entered the European war in full strength, Britain had already been fighting for years, alone at times, outnumbered at times, bombed, starved, cornered, and still refusing to fall. While politicians gave speeches and newspapers chased dramatic headlines, British soldiers, sailors, and pilots were fighting battle after battle that would shape the outcome of the war long before the cameras began pointing elsewhere. And yet, decades later, many of those victories were folded into a simpler version of history, a cleaner version, a louder version, one where America stood at the center of nearly every decisive moment, and Britain became little more than the opening act. But the war was never that simple. Take the Battle of Britain. Before there could be any great return to Europe, before any giant armies crossed beaches in the West, Britain had to survive. In 1940, Nazi Germany looked unstoppable. Country after country had fallen. France had collapsed. Much of Europe was under control or under threat. Britain stood exposed, an island in the path of a machine that seemed impossible to slow down. And yet, the invasion never came. Why? Because British pilots, radar crews, ground staff, and anti-aircraft units fought with a level of endurance that changed the course of the war. Day after day, they rose into the sky against overwhelming pressure. They didn't just defend airfields, they defended the possibility of resistance itself. If Britain had fallen then, there would have been no base for future liberation, no launching ground, no unsinkable fortress off the coast of occupied Europe. That victory mattered more than most people realize. But it wasn't the only one. There were naval battles in the Atlantic where British escorts protected lifelines across deadly waters long before American industry had fully shifted into war mode. There were desperate campaigns in North Africa where British-led forces fought, retreated, adapted, and struck back against some of Germany's most feared commanders. There were intelligence operations, convoy battles, code-breaking efforts, and brutal holding actions that kept the war alive when defeat seemed not just possible, but likely. Still, over time, memory changed. Not all at once, just little by little. Hollywood helped. So did post-war politics. So did the fact that America emerged from the war with unmatched economic power, massive cultural influence, and the loudest voice in the room. The bigger the platform, the easier it became to shape the story. And in that story, Britain was often praised, but rarely centered. Mention D-Day, and many imagine only American troops storming the beaches. Mention the Air War, and people often jump straight to American bombers over Europe. Mention victory in the West, and Britain can start to feel like a supporting character in its own survival story. But veterans remembered differently. They remembered 1940. They remembered the Mediterranean. They remembered convoys burning in black Atlantic waters. They remembered desert battles fought under a brutal sun, where British units learned through hard defeat how to stop an enemy many thought invincible. And some of them never quite got over how history was retold afterward. One former officer, speaking years after the war, once said that Britain had a strange habit. It won battles, then politely stepped aside while someone else told the story bigger. Maybe that was unfair. Maybe not. Because in war, victory on the battlefield is only one part of the struggle. The other victory comes later. On paper, on film, in classrooms, in speeches, in memory. And memory can be conquered too. That is what makes this story so powerful. Not because it is about taking anything away from American sacrifice. Far from it. The American forces paid dearly, fought bravely, and changed the course of the war in enormous ways. But bravery does not need exaggeration. Honor does not need erasure. Telling the truth about Britain's role does not diminish anyone else. It restores balance. And once you start looking closely, you begin to notice just how many crucial moments carried British fingerprints, even when the final story gave the spotlight to someone else. The veteran set the photo down on the table. "They came in strong," he said. "No one denies that. But by then, we'd already been bleeding for years." His voice was calm. No bitterness, just something heavier, memory. Then he reached for another photograph. This one showed ships, smoke, dark water, tiny figures on a deck under attack. He looked up and said, "You want to know where the real turning point started? Then don't start in 1944. Start where Britain had to fight with its back to the wall and still found a way to win." And that was where the hidden story truly began. The veteran's fingers rested on the second photograph for a long moment before he finally turned it around. A convoy at sea. Small ships, heavy smoke, men so distant they looked like shadows against steel and flame. "Everyone talks about the big offensives," he said quietly. "The landings, the breakthroughs, the final push. But wars aren't won only by the battles people remember. Sometimes they're won by the battles that make everything else possible." He tapped the image once. This was one of those. Because before liberation could ever begin, Britain had to survive long enough to make liberation possible. And survival, in those early years, was never guaranteed. The island nation that had refused to surrender in 1940 now faced another kind of danger. Slower, colder, less dramatic on camera, but every bit as deadly. Food, fuel, weapons, aircraft parts, medical supplies, troops, raw materials, everything Britain needed had to cross the sea. And in that sea waited German U-boats, long-range bombers, mines, and bad weather cruel enough to finish off whatever the enemy missed. It wasn't a glamorous war. There were no triumphant crowds on beaches, no flags rising over capitals, no instantly recognizable day that schoolbooks could stamp into memory. There was just the Atlantic, dark, endless, unforgiving. And in that darkness, Britain fought one of the most important struggles of the entire war. Convoys left port carrying not just cargo, but time. Every tanker that reached Britain bought more time. Every merchant ship that survived meant factories could keep working, pilots could keep flying, civilians could keep eating, and soldiers could keep preparing for battles that had not yet come. Lose that lifeline, and Britain would not need to be invaded. It would be weakened from within, starved into exhaustion, stripped of the strength required to remain in the war. That was the real German hope. Not always a dramatic knockout blow, sometimes just pressure, delay, attrition, a chokehold across the ocean. And for a while, it nearly worked. The sinkings mounted. Ships vanished into icy water. Crews died in minutes, sometimes seconds, swallowed by black waves before rescue could ever reach them. Escorts were stretched thin. Radar and sonar were improving, but never fast enough. Merchant sailors crossed knowing that one flash in the night might be the last thing they ever saw. Still, the convoys kept sailing. That was the part later retellings often missed. Britain did not simply endure one famous summer in the skies and then wait for rescue. It fought continuously. At sea, in the air, in intelligence rooms, in shipyards, in factories, in ports, in freezing watches on destroyer decks, holding together the fragile chain that kept the war effort alive. And British escorts paid for it. Corvettes, destroyers, frigates, small ships thrown into enormous weather and even larger danger, hunting submarines in conditions that punished every mistake. Their crews lived half-frozen and sleep-starved, moving through spray, darkness, and fear, never knowing whether the next contact on sonar would vanish or strike first. No glamour, no parade, just discipline and endurance. Years later, some of the men who served in those convoys would say the Atlantic was its own kind of prison sentence. Days of monotony shattered by seconds of terror. 1 minute, endless gray water. The next, alarms, shouting, explosions, men overboard, engines straining, signal lamps flashing into the storm. And still, the line held. Not perfectly, not cheaply, but it held. That mattered more than most people realize, because every later Allied success in Europe depended on Britain remaining in the fight. Every great offensive needed ships, supply routes, ports, protection, planning, and a base that had not fallen. The giant operations that would later dominate films and documentaries did not appear out of nowhere. They were built on years of survival, years in which Britain absorbed punishment and refused to break. But memory has a way of skipping the setup and rushing to the climax. That is why so many people jump straight to 1944. They skip the years when Britain stood in the storm and kept the war alive. They skipped the years when British sailors and merchant crews were dying in cold waters so that someone else, somewhere later, could have the means to strike back. And if you skip those years, you miss the shape of the truth. The veteran knew that. He'd seen too many documentaries that leaped from Britain's lonely stand straight into America's rise, as though the middle chapters were just empty water, as though convoy duty were background noise, as though survival itself were not a victory. He looked down again at the photograph. There were battles nobody could see clearly, he said. No clean front line, no one village to point at on a map, just miles of sea and men trying not to disappear into it. His voice stayed calm, but there was something in it now, something older than anger, recognition, for the men whose names rarely made it into the loudest versions of the story. Merchant crews who were civilians in all but danger. Royal Navy escorts that fought without the glamour of massive fleet showdowns. Signalmen, engine crews, gunners, lookouts, rescue parties. Ordinary men in steel hulls, keeping open the route that kept Britain breathing. And then there was another truth. While the Atlantic struggle raged, Britain was also fighting elsewhere, trying to hold ground, recover prestige, and stop the Axis from tightening its grip across the Mediterranean and North Africa. Those campaigns were messy, sometimes humiliating, sometimes brilliant, full of setbacks, reversals, reinventions, and hard-earned lessons. But they mattered. A great deal. Because while history often celebrates the later avalanche, Britain spent years fighting the smaller, harder battles that taught the Allies how not to lose, how to adapt, how to recover, how to survive contact with a dangerous enemy and come back stronger. That was one of the hidden patterns of the war, Britain learning the hard way, then holding on long enough for that knowledge to matter. The veteran slid the photo aside and reached for another. This one showed desert. Not ocean, not ruins, but dust, vehicles, and men squinting beneath a merciless sky. People love the final act, he said. They love the moment when the tide clearly turns. But they forget how many times Britain had to stand, fall, and stand again before the world was ready to call it victory. He set the desert photo on the table. In North Africa, he said, they learned that lesson the hard way. And with that, the next hidden chapter began. The desert photograph looked almost peaceful at first glance. Open sky, flat horizon, vehicles parked in the distance like toys abandoned in the sand. But the veteran knew better. There was nothing peaceful about North Africa, he said. Men died there slowly. From shells, from heat, from thirst, from exhaustion, from mistakes, and from underestimating an enemy who was faster, sharper, and far more dangerous than people wanted to admit. He pushed the photo forward across the table. People remember the famous names, he went on. Rommel, Patton, Montgomery. They remember the legends, the speeches, the clean summaries. But they forget that before the grand headlines came later, Britain had already spent years fighting, retreating, adapting, and paying the price for every lesson in blood. That was the truth North Africa rarely received in popular memory. It is often compressed into a few dramatic labels: the Desert War, the Africa Corps, El Alamein, the turning point. But to the men who lived it, North Africa was not a neat chapter. It was a grinding test of endurance, leadership, mobility, supply, and nerve. It was a theater where British and Commonwealth troops were fighting long before the United States became the dominant image in the Western War. And in those early campaigns, the British did not always look heroic. That, perhaps, is one reason the story is so often simplified afterward, because the road to victory in North Africa was not straight. It was humiliating at times, painful, confusing, full of false starts, overconfidence, bad coordination, missed chances, and sudden reversals that left men stunned in the dust, wondering how a hard-won position had collapsed so quickly. The enemy was clever, aggressive, and skilled at exploiting weakness. German armor and leadership earned a fearsome reputation in the desert, and British units learned quickly that reputation had teeth. One mistake in the open could become disaster in minutes. A weak flank, a missed signal, a delayed fuel convoy, a command failure, any of it could open the door to chaos. And chaos came often. Columns vanished into sandstorms. Supply lines stretched thin across punishing distances. Tanks broke down under extreme conditions. Artillery had to be repositioned over and over across open land with little cover. Men fought not only the enemy but the desert itself, a battlefield that offered no mercy and almost no place to hide. Yet, this is exactly why North Africa mattered so much. Because Britain stayed in that fight. It did not walk away after the setbacks. It did not collapse after the embarrassing moments. It kept rebuilding, reorganizing, relearning, again and again. That kind of persistence rarely looks dramatic in a single scene. It is harder to sell than the image of a sudden masterstroke. But wars are often won not by the army that never stumbles, but by the army that survives its stumbles, studies them, and returns stronger. In North Africa, Britain was doing precisely that. It was learning how to fight a modern mobile war against a dangerous opponent in brutal terrain. It was testing commanders, replacing some, trusting others. It was improving logistics, refining tactics, coordinating armor and artillery more effectively, and slowly hardening its forces into something more resilient than what had entered the theater before. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen cheaply. Every improvement was purchased at cost. At Tobruk, British and Commonwealth troops showed the kind of stubborn resistance that did not always fit the later stereotype of British forces as merely defensive or secondary players. Under siege, under repeated pressure, they held far longer than many expected. The garrison became a symbol not because conditions were easy, but because they were awful. Dust, bombardment, uncertainty, and relentless pressure wore men down day after day, yet the line remained. That mattered. It sent a message to friend and foe alike that the Desert War would not be decided by bold claims alone. Elsewhere, though, victories slipped away almost as soon as they appeared. Advances were made and then lost. Confidence returned and then shattered. There were moments when British leadership seemed hesitant, and others when brave men at the front paid for confusion farther back. Soldiers who had done everything asked of them could still find themselves ordered into situations shaped by poor timing, weak intelligence, or unrealistic assumptions. Those were bitter lessons. But they were lessons. And in war, lessons learned early can decide outcomes later. That is one of the most important truths hidden beneath the mythology of North Africa. Before the later Allied machine reached full force, Britain had already spent years figuring out what modern war in that theater demanded. Fuel mattered as much as courage. Repairs mattered as much as aggression. Timing, deception, communication, and discipline mattered just as much as raw firepower. The desert punished carelessness and rewarded preparation. British commanders did not always understand that fast enough, but eventually they did. The veteran gave a faint nod toward the photo, as if acknowledging men long gone. "They weren't perfect," he said. "That's what makes the story real. They got hit, they got outmaneuvered, they made mistakes, but they kept learning. And by the time the world started paying closer attention, Britain had already done the hard part, fighting the ugly middle of the war without applause. That ugly middle is what so many retellings skip. They jump from Britain's survival in 1940 to the later Allied surge, brushing past the years when British troops were absorbing the hard shocks of desert warfare. But that middle mattered because it forged experience. It built institutional memory. It exposed weaknesses while there was still time to fix them. It created officers and formations that understood not only how to attack, but how to endure pressure and recover from reverses. And Britain was not fighting there alone under its own flag in some narrow sense. The Desert War was also shaped by Commonwealth forces, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and others, whose role is often flattened when the war is reduced to a handful of famous names and later American-centered narratives. These men fought in the same heat, under the same shells, across the same merciless ground. Their contribution formed part of Britain's war effort, part of the larger imperial and Commonwealth system that kept armies in the field and made continued resistance possible. But memory prefers simpler casts. One hero, one turning point, one clean arc. Real war is messier than that. North Africa was messy. It was a place where reputations rose fast and cracked just as fast. A place where one bold move could make a commander look brilliant, and one overreach could make him look reckless. A place where ordinary soldiers were constantly asked to carry the consequences of decisions made far behind them. A place where survival itself required discipline so relentless it rarely makes it into dramatic speeches. Those were bitter lessons. But they were lessons. And in war, lessons learned early can decide outcomes later. That is one of the most important truths hidden beneath the mythology of North Africa. Before the later Allied machine reached full force, Britain had already spent years figuring out what modern war in that theater demanded. Fuel mattered as much as courage. Repairs mattered as much as aggression. Timing, deception, communication, and discipline mattered just as much as raw firepower. The desert punished carelessness and rewarded preparation. British commanders did not always understand that fast enough, but eventually they did. The veteran gave a faint nod toward the photo, as if acknowledging men long gone. "They weren't perfect," he said. "That's what makes the story real. They got hit, they got outmaneuvered, they made mistakes, but they kept learning. And by the time the world started paying closer attention, Britain had already done the hard part, fighting the ugly middle of the war without applause." That ugly middle is what so many retellings skip. They jump from Britain's survival in 1940 to the later Allied surge, brushing past the years when British troops were absorbing the hard shocks of desert warfare. But that middle mattered because it forged experience. It built institutional memory. It exposed weaknesses while there was still time to fix them. It created officers and formations that understood not only how to attack, but how to endure pressure and recover from reverses. And Britain was not fighting there alone under its own flag in some narrow sense. The Desert War was also shaped by Commonwealth forces, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and others, whose role is often flattened when the war is reduced to a handful of famous names and later American-centered narratives. These men fought in the same heat, under the same shells, across the same merciless ground. Their contribution formed part of Britain's war effort, part of the larger imperial and Commonwealth system that kept armies in the field and made continued resistance possible. Still, through all of it, Britain remained in the fight. That, by itself, was significant. Because every month Britain held on in North Africa was another month the Axis failed to secure complete dominance in the region. Every stubborn defense, every recovered position, every convoy unloaded, every workshop running in desert conditions, every battered formation rebuilt after losses. These were not side notes. They were part of the long process by which the war began to tilt. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but unmistakably. And when the real shift began to come, it did not emerge from nowhere. It rose out of all those earlier defeats that had taught caution, all those earlier recoveries that had built toughness. All those months when British and Commonwealth troops had done the hard, thankless work of staying alive, holding ground, and refusing to let the desert belong entirely to the enemy. The veteran's hand moved to the edge of the photograph. Then he drew out another. This one was different. More tanks, more men, more order. The kind of image that suggested not desperation, but preparation. He looked at it for a long time before speaking. "People love to say the tide turned at the moment everyone could see it," he murmured. "But tides begin moving before the crowd notices." He placed the new photograph on the table. "And when it finally began to turn in the desert," he said, "Britain was already the one pushing.